I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, while missiles and drones rain down on Ukraine, and especially on Kharkiv, Ukraine and its allies are still waiting for Russia's memo on their terms for a potential ceasefire and peace talks next week in Istanbul. We also discuss the increase of electronic warfare on the battlefield and share an exclusive interview with former Deputy Assistant to the US President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the US National Security Council, Fiona Hill.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 30th of May. 3 years and 96 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, chemical weapons expert and former tank commander. So today, I'm afraid, is just me doing the updates, both the military and the diplomatic. As Francis and Dom are both in Ukraine, so bear with me, I'll be speaking for a while. So, starting with the military updates as usual, we'll start with news from the front line. Russian forces are advancing in Ukraine's northeastern region near Sumy. They are pushing in two areas near Bilovody and Lokhnia, and the control over three key villages remains unclear. They're shown in grey zone on Deep State's map. These villages are Volodymyrivka and Konstantinivka. Russia is also pushing forward in Yunakivka and Khotin. That's quite important because if Yunakivka was to fall, Russian troops would be able to gain cover and fortify positions, as well as potentially launch FPV drone strikes directly on the city of Sumy. There have also been Russian pushes in northern Kharkiv Oblast, near Kupiansk, Borova, Liman and Pokrovsk. In Liman, there was a reported forest fire due to an airstrike. That's 155 hectares of forest burning. Some other Russian pushes north and south of Kupiansk, near the settlements of Zapadne, Kolesnikivka and Zarizovo. Northeast of Liman, near Yampolivka, south of Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk, along the front line from Toretsk to Mirolyubivka, and then further south from Sevchenko to Zelenopol. Now, these developments are important to note, but it's also important to keep in mind that they are incremental rather than indicative of great advances. And we've seen this countless of times on this podcast. A Russian push is often extremely costly in terms of manpower and materiel. Whether it will turn into a real advance that is strategic, we'll have to see in the future. Now, on Russia's strikes on Ukraine overnight. Russia has launched 90 Shaheeds and 2 ballistic missiles at Ukraine overnight. 56 drones were intercepted. 26 were shot down by fire and 30 were neutralized by electronic warfare. That's 62% of drones of the overall 90 that were sent. The ballistic missiles, however, were not intercepted and hits were recorded in 12 locations. So the main targets were Kharkiv's trolley bus depot, where 39 trolley buses were destroyed, and a Nova Poshta, that's the Ukrainian postal branch, office in Odessa that caught fire. 7 people were killed and 39 others were injured over the past day. That's 2 women in Kharkiv, 2 people in Zaporizhia Oblast, 1 person killed in Konstantinivka in Donetsk Oblast, and in Kherson Oblast, 4 people were killed and 11 others were injured. And for the other military updates, there has been a report from the Commander-in-Chief Alexander Syrsky that in May, Ukrainian soldiers were able to hit and destroy more than 89,000 Russian targets using drones of various types. So usually throughout the war, the targets for these drone strikes have been Russian vehicles, troops, but also some fortified positions. That's a report from the Commander-in-Chief that the Kyiv Independent was not able to verify independently. Continuing to talk about drones for a bit, and we'll come back to that in the rest of the podcast, is a report from Bloomberg on how China is increasing its drone deliveries to Russia and reducing its sales to Ukrainian and Western buyers. So the main drone that we're talking about here is called the DJI Mavic quadcopter that has been used by both Russia and Ukraine for surveillance and strike missions. Now, it's important to note that it's not only the sale of the drone, but also some of the components that has been reduced or stopped to Ukraine and other countries while continuing in Russia. Zelensky made that statement several days ago, and Bloomberg was able to confirm with an unnamed European official the fact, saying that the statement was consistent with European assessments of the situation. Now, the Institute for the Study of War has also observed that Russian forces are fielding Chinese-made equipment on the front line, and that China is also likely aware of and choosing not to stop Russian military recruitment of its citizens. Russia has also established joint production lines with China manufacturers for Shahed-like long-range strike drones. And all of these reports are obviously underscoring the extent of the PRC support for Russia's war effort. And I think it's important to note how all of these reports are underscoring the extent of China's support of Russia's war effort. Next update is the death of Russian city Stavropol's deputy mayor. His name was Zaur Gertsiev. He participated in Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine and most notoriously led Russia's aerial operation against Mariupol in 2022. He was killed in an explosion in a nighttime incident on Chekhov Street. And a Russian Telegram channel called Shot, which is close to the Russian security forces, suggested that the explosion may have been caused by a grenade or an improvised explosive device. Now, talking about countries supporting Russia's war effort is also North Korea, as we've covered many times in this podcast. The Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team, or MSMT, yes, that is a mouthful, which is a group made up of 11 United Nations member states formed in October 2024 to monitor and report on whether sanctions against North Korea work, has reported that Russia and North Korea have engaged in unlawful military cooperations that includes arms transfer, including up to 9 million shells and at least 100 ballistic missiles in 2024. Long-time listener will remember that David and I visited a Ukrainian forensics missile laboratory where the very first North Korean missiles that had been found in Ukraine were being dissected in order to understand what sort of components went in there and how they worked. If you've not listened to that report, I urge you to go back to the episode, I believe it's from December 16th, where we played the piece. And that report from the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team sheds a light on the deepening military ties between Moscow and Pyongyang. Continuing on drones, a report in Forbes talk about a mothership drone, the Gogol M, that is powered by artificial intelligence and that has for the first time been sent on autonomous missions against Russian military targets. And final military update before we move on is a Ukrainian commander which is facing trial to stop torture within his unit. That's a report from Ukraine's State Bureau investigation, which has completed its probe into Colonel Oleh Poberezhnyuk. He is the commander of the 211th Pontoon Bridge Brigade. And he's been accused of knowingly allowing torture and abuse of soldiers under his command to continue unchecked. The official statement says that it was determined that from February to July 2024, he was aware of repeated instances of torture and cruel treatment carried out by a subordinate officer but failed to take any action. The subordinate in question allegedly beat, humiliated and tortured fellow servicemen. That subordinate is no longer with the unit and the commander faces up to 12 years in prison if he ends up being convicted. Now, that's it for the military updates for today, folks. And now for the diplomatic updates. So today we're going to follow up on the back and forth between Russia and Ukraine ahead of the potential talks in Istanbul next week that may happen on June the 2nd. So the key issue that we discussed yesterday already is the memoranda that both countries are meant to draft ahead of the meeting and share with one another. That's in order for each side to come prepared and aware of each other's stance and make the meeting as constructive as possible. Now, the stalemate at the moment is that Russia wants Ukraine to commit to talks, which is all very well. Ukraine has said it was ready to hold more talks. Ukraine has demanded that Moscow supply its document setting out the conditions of peace, but Russia still hasn't done that. Now, the latest from this morning is from Ukrainian Presidential Office Chief Yermak. which again says that Ukraine is ready to attend the meeting, that they want it to be a constructive discussion, and that they want to see the draft. But Yermak is optimistic. He says there is enough time. 4 days are sufficient for preparing and sending the documents. That was in a conversation he had with leaders of the UK, Germany, France, and Italy. So 4 days, that's some time to see the memorandum. Now, that's all very well, and 4 days is indeed some time before June the 2nd. But Russia, for the past few days, have been stalling in providing this document. So I thought we could do a bit of a recap of the last few days, because it's been packed with rather tedious, I'm afraid, back and forth. But I think it's important to understand what's at stake with the memoranda and the game of cat and mouse that has been unfolding for the last couple of weeks. Now, it all starts on May 16th. The first round of talks in Istanbul, and the two delegations agree, I quote, to write down in detail what the terms of peace would look like for each side and for a memorandum for a possible future ceasefire. That did not come with a deadline. On May 19th, 3 days later, Putin tells journalists that Russia would indeed present Ukraine with a memorandum, with details on the conditions and the timings for a future peace treaty. But again, there's no deadline. Comes May 23rd, and Lavrov brings some sort of condition or deadline to the conversation because he says that Russia would indeed present its memorandum to Ukraine as soon as, however, the large-scale prisoner of war exchange would be conducted on May 25th. That's 2 days later. May 25th, the prisoner of war exchange happens. We're now almost 10 days after the first round of talks in Istanbul. On May 27th, 2 days later, General Keith Kellogg, the US Special Envoy to Ukraine, tells Fox News that the United States have received Ukraine's memorandum and the conditions and timeline for the potential peace treaty, and they're waiting on Russia. That was 3 days ago. On May 28th, 2 days ago, the Russian presidential aide Vladimir Medinsky, who led the Russian delegation in Istanbul, said that he had spoken with the Ukrainian Minister of Defense, Rustem Umerov, to propose a date for Russia and Ukraine to exchange their memoranda. Except that Ukraine has already turned in its memorandum to the United States. And that's the point that Umerov made to the Russian proposal, saying that, again, Ukraine is ready for a ceasefire and for negotiations, but it has indeed turned its copy in. And comes now yesterday, where Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that he'd not received a copy of Ukraine's memorandum and that Ukraine had not responded to Lavrov's proposal. And so that, everyone, is what had happened over the last few days. As you can tell, it's very tedious. What seems to be happening is that Russian officials appear to be withholding the memorandum. And the question is, will they withhold it until the meeting on June the 2nd? Now, the agreement from May 16th is that these memoranda would be exchanged ahead of the second round of talks for each side to be able to consider each other's stance and come up with their own negotiation strategy. Bringing the memorandum on June the 2nd is not really giving Ukraine a chance to think ahead of sitting down at the table. What follows then is whether Ukraine will attend the Istanbul peace talk if Russia's memorandum hasn't come through. And that's a way of framing Ukraine for the failure of these peace talks, if they were to do so. So that's where we are, and what does that tell us? Well, not only that Russia is stalling in order to put Ukraine in a position to drop out of the potential talks on June the 2nd, but also of their opposing approaches to a potential ceasefire. Zelensky said yesterday, even the so-called memorandum they promised and claimed to be preparing for more than a week, no one has seen it. Ukraine hasn't received it, our partners haven't received it, even Turkey, which hosted the first meeting, hasn't received the updated agenda. Words won't work with Moscow. They're doing everything to make these meetings meaningless. That's why sanctions and real pressure on Russia are essential. Now, that really talks to the fact that each country's approach to a potential ceasefire is at opposite ends. The Ukraine, the United States, and European states have repeatedly called for Russia to agree on a renewable ceasefire before beginning negotiations. And that's something the Kremlin has repeatedly rejected. Russians, on the other hand, are demanding that negotiations address both a ceasefire and the long-term peace agreement in Ukraine. So one side wants a ceasefire before starting negotiations, the other wants negotiations on the ceasefire as well as a long-term peace treaty. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue to press along the front line in order to pressure Ukraine in a position to extract additional concessions. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, has previously assessed that Russian forces are leveraging the fact that Ukraine and Russia set no concrete deadlines for the next steps in the peace process in order to delay the process altogether and prolong the war. Now, there are reports of what could be allegedly included into Russia's memorandum, as reported by the Kyiv Independent, is that it would include a written pledge that NATO would not expand further eastward, effectively blocking Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova from joining, as well as the lifting of Western sanctions, the unfreezing of Russian assets, and the protection of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. As we discussed yesterday, there's also the pretension of continuing to annex some of Ukraine's territory, including some of the areas that Russia does not fully control at the moment. Meanwhile, US Special Envoy for Russia and Ukraine Keith Kellogg said in an interview with ABC yesterday that Russia's concerns about NATO expanding eastward are fair. I quote, "We've said many times that Ukraine's NATO membership is not on the table," he said, and he added that 4 of the 32 other NATO countries also share his view. Now, that's where we're left on Friday, May 30th. It remains to be seen whether Russia sends its memorandum over the weekend and whether peace talks are indeed happening on June the 2nd in Istanbul. And that's it from me for the diplomatic and the military updates. And now joining us on the podcast is Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Hamish, are you here? Can you hear me?
Adélie, yeah, here. Thanks very much for having me on, and amazed that the two amigos have left you on your own today.
Yes, fending for myself indeed, but also holding the fort and happy to, while Dom and Francis are getting incredible interviews and reports from Ukraine. So we have a lot to talk about. I wanted to come back to a point from the military updates on the use of mothership drones and artificial intelligence. Could you explain to us a bit more what these mothership drones are and why the use of artificial intelligence is so strategic?
Yeah, sure, Adélie. Absolutely. I think this is a fascinating story, and it's linked up to a lot of the other stuff we're going to discuss after this. But number one, it shows how warfare brings innovation. And as we've discussed many times before, quite how innovative the Ukrainians are and have had to be a lot of the time because they haven't had all the military hardware that they need to fight somebody like the Russians. So they have got down to it. What is really interesting about this mothership idea, it solves a whole bunch of problems. Now, we're going to talk about in a minute about the electromagnetic spectrum. That is the main way that drones and surveillance assets maneuver around the battlefield is by commands sent through the electromagnetic spectrum. But it also creates vulnerabilities, and it's very easy to jam, as we've seen. And what is really clever about this mothership idea is it's using autonomous navigation enabled by AI so that it can get around the battlefield and identify its targets without any electronic reference to its base controllers, as it were. So that is the number one thing that is really clever. The number two thing is really about resources and finance. So we understand this mothership can carry 2 FPV drones around a distance about 300 kilometers. And then those FPV drones can attack different targets. Now, we know how effective FPV drones are, but they only have a range of maximum 5 kilometers. But if you could put them on a carrier, if you like, that is going to move them 300 kilometers, and then they can attack from there, how really clever is that? If we look at a missile that would attack a target 300 kilometers away, we're looking at something like the Storm Shadow or the Taurus missile that we're going to come on to in a minute. Now, these missiles cost about $1 million a throw, or even more. But we understand this mothership concept. We're talking about $10,000. So for $10,000, you can replicate something like a sophisticated Taurus missile and actually attack 2 different targets. Now, the cruise missiles that we're talking about generally attack 1 target. So you've got 2 FPV drones. So what that's doing is that's really extending the range and capability what Ukraine has at a fraction of the cost of having to buy these expensive missiles or expecting them to come from Western donors. Of course, it also creates a hell of a capability that I bet every NATO country wants to get hold of these as well. So hopefully it'll really increase operational tempo and the ability to strike deep into Russian positions at a fraction of the cost, but also it's creating a defence industry that Ukraine will be able to move forward on. So I think a really interesting way to get around some of the challenges that Ukraine has at the moment with money and resources, but also get around this issue with the electromagnetic spectrum, which to me, the person who controls the electromagnetic spectrum controls the battlefield. And if you're going to progress and win on the battlefield, you need to control it so that you've got freedom of manoeuvre. Does that sort of make sense, Adélie?
That does make sense. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about the upcoming strategic defence review that's coming up on Monday, and go maybe a little bit into why you think battle tanks have not had their day yet, despite the EMS controlling the battlefield?
Absolutely. I wrote a piece that's on the Telegraph website today. The original headline was what most people say, typical Hamish Bretton-Gordon tank commander. Of course, he'd be saying there's still use for a tank on the battlefield, and he'd probably say there's still use for a well-bred horse, which I think was the cry after the end of the First World War. Actually, the headline on my piece now, Ukraine teaches us how to build a tank which can survive and win on a drone battlefield. When technology is changing warfare at an exponential rate, it's almost impossible to develop military capability that will sustain. And strategic defence view, how Britain is going to develop its military capability over the next decade is what it's all about. But, I mean, it is a huge challenge that we've seen the pace of change in Ukraine over the last 3 years. At the beginning of the Ukraine conflict, we were really training the Ukrainians. Now we are learning from them 3 years later because they've been so intensely involved in this conflict. And it's very much evolved. And everybody thinks it's all about drones, and drones have changed the way we fight. Well, drones haven't changed the battlefield, as it were. It's changed the way we use capability to fight. But fundamentally, the principles of war are absolutely unchanged. And I think when looks at how Britain is going to go in the strategic defence view, it's very important that a lot of very clever people have been working on this, and I wouldn't suggest anything else, that they get the right lessons from it. But if I could just unpick a few areas. We've already talked about the electromagnetic spectrum. I'll call it the EMS to get tongue-tied around this. And this is the way that we communicate. Voice communications, digital communications. This is how we control our drones. This is how everything moves around the battlefield. But the war in Ukraine has come so dependent on it. Actually, the main way to defend against drones is not to shoot them down with expensive missiles. You've got a drone that costs $500, but you've got an air defense missile that costs $500,000. It doesn't compute. So with the great innovation on both sides, they've worked out if you can stop the signal, if you like, if you can control the electromagnetic spectrum, then you can stop drones operating. And that's what we see all across the battlefield. There are actually many people with anti-drone jammers rather than air defense weapons. So that is really negating, in a way, the effectiveness of the drones, which have been ubiquitous and have been doing everything. Now, sure, the swarms that we're seeing now of thousands of drones, ones will get through, but now people are having to think the way around that and how to operate in this environment. They're now almost in what we call reversionary modes. They're retrofitting drones or fitting drones with fibre optic cables in order to guide them around because they don't have to use electromagnetic spectrum. And you've got the prospect of a drone trailing 3 kilometres of fibre behind it so that the ground controller can direct it, which it gets around the problem of it being jammed by EMS jammers. But again, it reduces its agility. And actually, it's going back. Anti-tank guided weapons 30 years ago were controlled by wire, not fibre optic cable, but actually wires. And if you look at some of the battlefields, particularly in the Middle East, they're actually strewn with all these wires. And I can remember in a tank regiment in the First Gulf War, after a big battle, when you were going around the battlefield, again, you'd see all these wires from these anti-tank guided weapons. So it's really going back to the old. And I think why I'm talking about tanks is I think everybody has seen how many thousands of tanks have been destroyed in Ukraine. I would say predominantly they are very old Russian tanks, which both sides have, which are susceptible to an FPV drone dropping a hand grenade into it. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about old Russian tanks have their ammunition not stored in armoured charge bins, therefore a great grenade can set the whole thing off. But my sort of point is, when we look at some of the modern technology being developed for the Challenger 3 tanks, and we already see it on the Israeli Merkava tank, they have these defensive aid suites that will knock drones down anyway. And I suppose my point is saying is people who write something like tanks off because they can be destroyed by drones are perhaps looking at the wrong area here. They having something that provides protection to the soldiers in it and creates a hell of a punch at the end is still viable. And let's face it, 1917 was the first big tank battle at Cambrai, and literally ever since then, people have said it, the end of the tank. We are now 100 and whatever it is, 10 years beyond that, and it's still an issue. So I suppose my nod to the UK Strategic Defence Review is let's make sure we get the right lessons. There was a leak the other day, John Healey, the Defence Secretary, saying we're setting up a cyber and electromagnetic spectrum command. That seems very sensible to me to do because cyber and the EMS is so important, as I said. And there's talk about a new drone regiment being developed too. But one would hope that is not at the expense. It would be very easy to get rid of some tank regiments and some infantry battalions. But what Ukraine is also showing us that the art of soldiering is still the same. You still need robust men and women, well trained, in order to operate on this battlefield. And mass amounts are still important. Russia has allegedly lost up to 1 million men. Now, what that means is that the recruits, the conscripts going onto the front line now are barely trained. Therefore, they can do very little except fire their rifle and march in a straight line, which again increases their casualty rate to some horrendous perspective. So I think when it comes to military procurement, this fast-moving technology is so difficult. If you want a new helicopter, it's going to take about 10 years for you to get that helicopter. And in that 10 years, the situation has so completely changed. And I think we've got a lot to learn from the Ukrainians on this as well. Their innovation. We've talked about this mothership drone that has been developed in the last year or so by some really clever people who've seen the situation and then come up with a solution. Now, it's more difficult for NATO countries like Britain and France and Germany to do this sort of thing, but we need to learn from it and buy stuff off the shelf that's good enough and then adapt it rather than try and get something shiny and new that fits our requirements. Everybody said, well, what's the difference between a civilian drone and a military drone if the UK Ministry of Defence buying it? Well, the UK Ministry of Defence will buy a green one, which will be twice as expensive, but actually it's exactly the same. So those are my points. And perhaps I'll come on back next week when the review's announced and discuss how close or not we were to the mark. Over.
We definitely will. Thank you for that. That was a deep dive, really enlightening for a laywoman like me. The other point I wanted to bring up is Western missiles, because they can now target deep into Russia. That's something you wrote about, I believe, on Wednesday, isn't it? That Moscow could now be in range. What do you mean by that? And what are the implications that we may see as the war continues to unfold?
I think it's really, really significant. And I'm not trying to spin anything that's been made up. The meeting between Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, and President Zelensky this week, I think was hugely significant on a whole bunch of areas. Not least because Germany, without wanting to be too simplistic, is back in the game. Germany is such an economically powerful country, does have such a large military, but hasn't, for a whole host of reasons, developed it and updated it. They do have some amazing kit. The German defence industry produces some amazing kit. But it is only Merz, now that he is the Chancellor, that has really taken the shackles off and has said, yeah, Ukraine is our problem as well. It's just very close to us. And it is behest on Germany to really lean into this. and get fully into supporting Ukraine, which it hasn't done in the past. And the changing of the rules on their defence procurement, and they're running a debt to fund it, the announcement that they're looking to spend 200 billion euros over the next 5 years on developing their defence is hugely significant. It's not just symbolic. Psychologically, I think it gives a fillip to the rest of Europe. And hopefully, when Putin looks out of the Kremlin West and sees that Germany is stirring, that will give him something else to think about. But the other thing that he announced, I think just for this meeting, that there were no range restrictions on any Western missiles. Now, whether that's a recent decision, I think I suggested that maybe the West had held a bit of restriction on distance until after Putin's parade on the 9th of May. Who knows? And Merz has been quite cagey about whether the German missile, 500 kilometres, very clever missile, hugs the ground, so very difficult to intercept, and then jumps up at the last minute and fires warhead that penetrates deep into whatever target. So you can't hide in a bunker under the Kremlin sort of thing if they fire a Taurus missile at it. So now that we know that, say, Moscow is in range, and of course, we've discussed many times the previous Ukrainian drone attacks on Moscow, the fact that Muscovites are getting really hacked off, that those who are brave enough to go on a Russian aircraft or a Russian Western aircraft that hasn't been maintained for the last 3 years to Sochi or somewhere like that have been deeply frustrated that these drones have shut the airports quite frequently. I think then with the perspective of perhaps a Taurus or a Storm Shadow or whatever hitting targets in Moscow, again, psychologically, that could have a huge impact. And all of these things, I don't want to see anybody killed or whatever, but what one is hoping is the battlefield, not just in Ukraine, but as far as Russia and elsewhere, is shaped so that a ceasefire can happen. At the moment, it seems that Putin has no interest in peace at all. If the West can do things, if Trump at least can introduce sanctions, 500% he's talking about, and cripple the Russian oil industry, then that will cripple his military effort. So going back to the ability to strike into Moscow, again, it's hopefully forcing the hand of Putin and his close advisors that actually the best way out is to Istanbul next week and negotiate a genuine ceasefire rather than all these ridiculous caveats that Russia, each time the staffers rewrite their ceasefire deal, they add something else, which is completely unacceptable. So I think that's why it is important. And actually, if you tie it into what we were talking about, the mothership drones, if these $10,000 mothership drones can project 300 kilometers into Russia again, that is a very, very significant piece as well. So I know that you guys discussed it earlier on, but the ability to not only strike Moscow, but a lot of the airfields that are launching all these attacks into Ukrainian cities, if they have to be pushed another 500 kilometers back, they are going to be a lot less effective. If some of the logistics nodes have to be pushed back, again, that will have an overall impact. And I've said it before, I still think the Russian army is close to culminating. That means it's really running out of energy. And these are just another cuts. And let's hope that this will be a significant cut that will bring Putin and agree to a proper ceasefire, ideally next week. I'm sure I'm being overambitious there. But all these things put together hopefully get us to the direction where we can have a just ceasefire for the Ukrainians.
Before we move on, a little halftime treat from Dom and Francis. They arrived in Ukraine yesterday and they sent me a voice note as they were setting off for their first day of reporting.
Well, hi, Adélie. I'm here with Francis. We're in the hotel, about to head out for the day. Got a load of things lined up. We're in Ukraine, got here late last night. Won't say where we are for obvious reasons, but we are keen to try and take the temperature as much as we're able to from various policymakers, officials, journalists and other commentators ahead of these talks on Monday, the next round of quote-unquote peace talks, the so-called peace negotiations in Istanbul on Monday. What can be expected from it? What's the best case scenario? What's the most likely likely? What's the worst case scenario to come out of those Istanbul talks? What else are we looking at? Well, this coalition of the willing, if it's not quite yet a coalition of the unwilling, it's certainly in the bounds of coalition of the willing to do what? Because we've not really heard an awful lot of detail about that, so we'll be trying to pick that apart. And also this extraordinary comment from Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, the other day, when asked, would Germany be prepared to send Taurus missiles? He said, it's in the realm of possibility. You know, that's not a very unequivocal yes, or indeed a no, to be fair, but in the realm of possibility. Not quite the language we've been led to expect from Friedrich Merz. So we're going to see how that kind of comment has gone down here as well.
Yeah, just on that, actually, I'm very interested in this subject because I think, on the one hand, the Germans have done quite a lot in the last week or so with those weapons permissions that we were talking about on the podcast in recent days. And yet, symbolically, it would be so powerful to send Taurus. And I just wonder whether Berlin sees Taurus as being yesterday's conversation. Whilst anybody who's listening to this and us who've been reporting on this for 3 years, that has enormous symbolic value. And I think that there will be a lot of people putting pressure on Berlin to say, look, even if the conversation has moved on, that you're doing much, much more, this still is symbolic of where you are and how far you are willing to go. And thus you need to do something on that. So yes, it'll be very interesting seeing the degree to which these conversations matter here in Ukraine amongst ordinary people as well. And I think what always strikes you when you're here is the degree to which some of the conversations that are taking place in Western capitals don't necessarily cut through here because it doesn't massively impact the day-to-day life. The bombardments continue and there is very little expectation of there being the prospect of a long-lasting peace anytime soon. So some of these kinds of stories, whilst we think they could potentially be seismic for people here, rarely they have the kind of impact that one might expect.
So that's what we're going to be up to for the next few days. We'll be dialing into the pod when we can. Always nice to chat to you, Adélie. But for now, I mean, it's a very odd atmosphere here. It's a beautiful blue sky, light wind, 20 degrees. It's gorgeous. But then there have been air attacks last night across Ukraine. The atmosphere here doesn't really belie what's happening just a few kilometers away, and indeed, possibly here as well. So it's a very strange time. But we're in a beautiful place, and we're going to be travelling around and speaking to a lot of people and chatting to you when we can.
And now we have an interview with Fiona Hill. Hill served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for European and Russian Affairs on the US National Security Council from 2017 to 2019, as well as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the US National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009. You may also have heard of her through her testimonies before Congress in 2019 during the first impeachment inquiry against President Donald Trump. Our correspondent in the US, Cameron Henderson, spoke with her earlier this week in a candid interview where she shared that World War III could very well be upon us. She started by telling us just how much the face-off with Russia had changed since the end of the Cold War, when she herself started studying Russian, and how the UK should position itself in the face of new front lines and threats, both physical and virtual. Here's the interview.
Well, I think the broad brush is pretty obvious that, the UK has to find a way to adapt to rapidly changing sets of circumstances. And the homeland is no longer secure in the way that it has been since the Cold War. And it's insecure in different ways to the Cold War, frankly. Back in the day in the 1980s, we had the war scare. 1983, I started studying Russian because of that. In 1984, the whole issue was about the prospect of a nuclear exchange between the US and the Soviet Union, or NATO in the Soviet Union. And now it's much more about critical national infrastructure and mass acts of sabotage, poisonings, assassinations. There's a latest story out of Sweden about big question marks about this accused Swedish spy from the defence sector suddenly being found dead, and all these kinds of things now. I mean, basically the homeland is insecure from all kinds of sub-threshold attacks from Russia and others, cyber attacks all the time. And I think, what we just saw in the case of Spain, where you had that massive power outage, which looks like it was probably a failure of the grid in various capacities, or the transformer at Heathrow. All of those, I think, really can concentrate the mind on the kinds of problems that we're facing. It's not the likelihood of a Russian tank coming across the Suffolk Downs, or necessarily a nuclear weapon taking out Sheffield back in the 1980s when you had all the films about that comes straight to my mind. It's really about all of those other forms of attack, and we need to have a more resilient society, not just addressing the issues of what kind of kit the military needs there to best posture itself for the 21st century. So that's it in the broad brush. I know there's been all kinds of jokes being made about Dad's army because there's been some partial leak of information about Homeland Defence, and people have obviously as suspected without reading it at all, going on about, well, that sounds like we're going back to the past. But frankly, when society is under assault in the way that it is, you need to have people more prepared. And the EU is doing all of that already. And you look at Finland, Sweden, Norway, the Baltic states. Poland's close to spending 5% of GDP on defence because they know that they're really close to the front lines there. And what we're arguing is the physical front lines in terms of the likelihood of an invasion by Russia may be further away, but the other front lines are here all the time. They're your IT systems, your electrical grids, your power stations, etc., etc.
How vulnerable is Britain, if you could quantify it?
Every country is massively vulnerable, and it has to be the private sector as well as the military. The biggest line of protection that most countries have are their IT providers. I mean, at Brookings, our guys are on call 24/7 looking for intrusions, so I'm sure they are at Telegraph as well, obviously. And if you think about it, Microsoft is more likely to call out a problem than it is going to be the federal government or the DoD or Ministry of Defence in the UK.
If I could pivot slightly, Fiona, you're one of very few people who have spent time closely with Donald Trump and also sat down for dinner a number of times with Vladimir Putin. I wonder, how would you rank Trump's performance based on what we know from his call with Putin last week, or this week on Monday?
And let's give him a pass for effort. Now I'm going to sound like a teacher meeting with a parent-teacher association here where you don't want to be too rude to the parents. But, I mean, look, basically, President Trump genuinely wants to find an end to the war, right? But he just doesn't know how to go about it. He believes genuinely that Putin wants a deal. Of course Putin wants a deal. Absolutely, 100%. Putin wants a deal. He wants his deal. What Trump wants is a ceasefire that he can tick off on a box, secures a ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia. Now I move on. Because he wants to reset the US-Russian relationship. He wants to do all kinds of deals with Putin on an economic level, but he also wants to make a big nuclear deal, getting back to this whole concern to the 1980s. He's still obsessed with the risks of nuclear exchange from that whole Cold War period. He wants to sit down, have a new strategic arms reduction treaty. He always talks about this all the time. And of course, all kinds of deals that would interest him and the people around him, I mean, they're not really going to be relevant for the US economy. But for Russia, this would be an important signal that Russia is no longer a pariah state and anybody can do business with Russia, but it's not the US. And maybe it's not Europe, but nobody else is going to get sanctioned with secondary sanctions for doing business for Russia. I mean, with Russia, that's a big deal for the Russians. All of this looks like a great incentive for the Russians to basically play along with Trump. But the only problem is that Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. So basically what Trump is doing is almost answering the wrong exam question. I can't really think of any other analogies, but to give Trump credit, he talks about this all the time. It's senseless, it's a bloodbath. Absolutely 1000% right. The Ukrainians would actually agree, totally senseless. There was no reason to be invaded apart from Vladimir Putin's fever dreams about restoring the lands of the Russian Empire, and the bloodbath is on Putin. The Russians are not defending anything. The Ukrainians are defending themselves, so of course anything that they're incurring in times of cost is because of their survival. It's existential for them. And for Putin, he has been squandering human life, both in Ukraine but in Russia on a colossal scale. I mean, this is the largest, as we know, military operation on European territory since World War II. The Russians are approaching, the kind of 1 million casualty mark in terms of people grievously wounded and injured enough to be taken off the battlefield at the same time. And Putin has every intention of going on here. So he's willing to pay that price. The question for Putin is Ukraine going to capitulate? And is he going to basically be accepting Ukraine's surrender? And, I said Trump wants a ceasefire. The Ukrainians want a just peace that leaves them secure. And even if they have to give up territory de facto for the foreseeable term, they want 100% guarantees of their security, not these kind of mealy-mouthed guarantees that they got in the Budapest Memorandum back in 1994 that, we assure you that we will make sure you're okay if you're ever attacked as a result of giving up your nuclear weapons. And of course, they've learned from that exercise that we can't be trusted unless we've got ironclad security guarantees. And Putin, of course, wants a neutralized Ukraine, a neutered Ukraine, not one that is able to withstand the military pressure. Everybody sees this apart from Trump. And so, as I said, it's almost like he's answering the wrong question, how to get a ceasefire. There's been so many discussions about ceasefires that never held. This is what Zelensky tried to tell him in the Oval Office, all the hundreds of times that ceasefires are violated elsewhere. But that's what Trump wants. And now he's losing interest because it looks like that's not coming. And we saw the same thing with Gaza and Israel. But he's kind of walked on, including from Israel, frankly, and from being quite as engaged with Netanyahu.
In those meetings we've had, not just the direct Trump and Putin meeting, but also those talks that we've seen Kharkiv engaging with the Russians. Can you give us any insight into Putin's negotiating team and the sort of tactics they're using?
Well, yeah, this is the same negotiating team they've always been there and have always been using. And Putin's been in place for 25 years and he's kept a pretty tight team around him. Yeah. And he rolled out to Istanbul recently, the same general set of people he rolled out to the last Istanbul talk. People like Ushakov, Lavrov, they've all been in place for an extraordinarily long time. They can basically talk, the old expression goes, the hind leg off a donkey. They can just turn you around in circles. They've got an answer for everything. They know all the legal ins and outs. They know the root causes, as in inverted commas, which they keep putting down to Trump and his team of the conflict from their perspective. The root causes that Ukraine wants to be independent. It has been independent for the last 30 plus years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and they don't believe that any country in Eastern Europe has the right to do anything on its own if it was formerly within the Soviet bloc or within the Russian Empire. And especially countries like Ukraine or Belarus or Moldova or Kazakhstan that were so intricately twined in history with their perception of the core of Russian land since the 17th and 18th centuries. And again, these guys are really skilled diplomats. They all speak absolutely excellent English. Putin also speaks English. They're eating the neophytes on the US side for dinner. And that's what's tragic, because there's not just a small kind of group around Trump who could be helpful there. There are still people in the US government, not everybody is left or being kicked out, who could help them. I'm sure that they're using an interpreter for some of the things, so they have to, but they're not getting the context interpreted for them. Witkoff is going out and basically dealing with it's like a real estate deal, because again, Trump thinks it's just about real estate. It's all about territory and who gets what, be it minerals, raw earths. It's all about trade and trade space. Actually, if you knew anything about Russian history, which, certainly my experience, I wasn't really particularly interested. He's only interested in his story, his history, him and how he interacts with people. And he says openly, it's all about him and his charismatic personality. And everyone around him says, absolutely, it's all about him and his charismatic personality. But the Russians were themselves the Muscovites, the bagmen for the Mongols. They were the people who went around and got the tribute and strong-armed everybody into giving things up. That's how they survived and prospered when the Mongols came in, and then they kind of moved on to keep on doing that. And so for Putin, it's also a deal. It's not real estate, it's similar, but it's really about the price and the cost for any territory that they want to conquer. And, Trump's still thinking in terms of Gaza Rivieras or deals. Witkoff's probably thinking about condos in Moscow. And they think that it's, really tough being in Queens or in New York. Yeah, it's tough, but it's not as tough as it is trying to do something in Russia, where people have propensities to fall out of poorly sealed and easily opened windows in high buildings that you wouldn't be allowed with code in New York to have. There's a lot going on in the Russian context that they're not factoring in. And now Trump's starting to say that now. He's saying it has to be direct between Russia and Ukraine because only they know the details of this negotiation. And it's like, yeah, but when are you going to mediate? Getting back to our ranking here, you usually figure out what the parties both want. And with Trump, it's all about what leverage does he have, because this negotiation is all about him and him getting something that he wants. It's not about Russia and Ukraine. It's him inserting himself into this particular conflict. The United States obviously has had a role in this, and it had become a proxy war against the United States on the part of certainly Russia. But, China, North Korea and Iran have come into this as well. Trump is now negating all that, saying nothing to do with us, not our war. And what he wants more than anything else is basically to remain close to Putin, politically and personally and all the rest of it. So that's what we see. And the fact that the Europeans are so shocked by his deference to Putin actually shows that they haven't also done their homework and really understand the nature of this hyper-personalized relationship between Trump and Putin. There's nothing shocking there. Basically, Trump is enthralled by Putin, and as a result becomes enthralled to him. He's just captivated by the guy.
Do you basically see any possibility other than the US walking away at this point?
Yeah, there are all kinds of other possibilities, but it means that people have to work really hard at it. I'm pointing that out because it is the most likely scenario. Absent Trump being persuaded, which is what all of the Europeans offered, is really trying very hard. The UK has been playing a leading role in this. You'd still want the United States to be providing Ukraine with the means to help defend itself. Ukraine has done an awful lot in the last 3+ years to do that. And the UK and many other European countries have been instrumental in that. But I mean, at this point, I'm going to bring in another metaphor here because I think it actually also illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. I mean, Ukraine needs to basically just put up a really robust defense of itself, and we have to help it do that to deny Putin the ability to move any further. So we need the US to still be enabling and selling weapons to Europe and to Ukraine for this, and helping share some of the intelligence to help the Ukrainians defend themselves against drone attacks and all the other missile attacks that they're experiencing.
You mentioned previously that Putin has weaknesses, and I wonder what they are and how the US, how Trump should try to exploit them if you were being sensible.
Well, I think Trump's going to exploit them, but the Russian economy isn't doing great. And everyone that you talk to is in the economic field, or investors and others, of the view that Trump is just basically helping Putin in ways that he just didn't absolutely have to. The Russian economy is pretty resilient for a variety of reasons. Oil prices are going down, and the budget edges something above $60 a barrel. It's very much now a militarized war economy, which makes it very difficult to pivot to something else. They're still getting technology, and it's a pretty porous sections of the regime because they get stuff in from China and Turkey and Armenia and India and all kinds of other countries. But look, if the US pulled out and Europe was left there, Europe would be able to say to the Chinese, the Indians and Iranians, everything, but you want to be fight with us now, not with the United States. You've kind of declared war on Europe. Is that what you meant?
Right.
It isn't what they meant. And that would be some real significant leverage. And while it's all about Trump, and Trump makes it all about himself, or it's all about the United States, then actually they'll react accordingly. Would people be so concerned about helping Putin and helping Russia if this was really just about Ukraine?
Yeah.
And then about European security, and about, well, what about if Europeans just say, well, look, then we're not going to do business with you in the same way in the future? I mean, the European economies are vulnerable as well, but there could be North Korea is probably impervious to that. But the Iranians, they want to do business again with Europe. Maybe not with the UK quite as much, but certainly with other Europeans. But China has no desire to have a rupture with Europe. In fact, China was hoping to exploit the rupture between the United States and Europe without realizing that Ukraine is actually a pretty critical issue for most European countries. And I think there's all kinds of different ways of thinking about this. And obviously, if the United States wanted to, and Trump often talks about this, energy and going after the shadow fleet and all kinds of ways of hitting Russia's vulnerabilities on energy, which is mostly an oil sector now, making sure that Europe never gets and totally weans itself away from Russian gas. And the US with LNG are the number one providers for Europe now, and just making that very clear that that's not going to be an option for the Russians. And then trying to work on the countries that continue to supply Russia. But again, Europe could do this, but it would be better to do it in coordination with the United States, because obviously in the banking and financial sector, that's where the US has the most weight.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And now, what Trump is doing is making it look like the Russian economy is going to be open for business again very quickly if anybody wants to do trading and financial sector trading, and you see the markets react to that. But there's not a lot of prospect of major manufacturing industry going back into Russia.
Yeah.
And also, it's very hard to imagine how the economy would be demilitarized, and you're already seeing signs of building back up along all the other borders with NATO countries.
Trump's obviously floating this prospect of all sorts of deal with Russia if it complies with his plans. We've heard some sources talking about this idea of a carrot and hammer approach being adopted by the US. I wondered if that is something you're familiar with for a start. And if so, why are we seeing so much of the carrot, which is offering concessions, as opposed to the hammer, which would be sanctions on energy, for example?
You talking about it's just like the carrot and stick, or the specified hammer?
Well, specifically that there are supposedly two teams within the State Department, one of whom is trotting out carrot scenarios and one of whom is working on the hammer ones.
And look, we're having an event at Brookings, I think June 5th in the morning, about the whole sanctions with Lindsey Graham and some of our colleagues here at the European Economic Studies who were under the Biden administration responsible for putting all the various sanction packets together, Brian Harris and a host of others who are at the Treasury.
Yeah.
And there's always all kinds of packages that can be prepared, but it doesn't mean that Trump is going to put them in place.
Yeah.
They're all basically coordinated with Europe. And that's what I was saying before. There's all kinds of things that can be done to increase the squeeze, but it's unlikely that Trump's going to do that.
Yeah.
Now, Congress done it already, but it's all down to Trump. And one of my colleagues, Angela Stent, who's done a lot of work on, obviously, the attempts to forge some kind of different relationship across all the various presidencies with Russia. She's got a book called Limits of Partnership, which traces the whole trajectory of relationships since under the Soviet Union all the way through. There's a quip that, if you offer the Russians a carrot, they just eat it, or they take it and hit you over the head with it. So the whole idea of creating a bunch of incentives for the Russians, they just take it. I mean, that's totally irrelevant. Trump is completely, again, misreading, not understanding at all Putin and the way that he thinks.
Yeah.
The entourage, the circle around Putin have enriched themselves so much by availing themselves of all the goodies that the state can provide. What is it that Trump can give them that they don't already have? And he can't save the regime or ensure that Putin won't get into trouble if he demilitarizes. We've already had the Prigozhin effect. He could do nothing for Putin apart from give him a massive victory and hand over Ukraine to him.
Yeah.
So, Trump always thinks that everybody wants to do the deal with the US, and Putin does want to do various deals with the US, but not over Ukraine, unless Ukraine is going to be surrendered it. Yalta and, kind of the end of World War II.
You mentioned a few stories in the past about your various dinners where Putin was attending. I think you've spoken about being able to tell he wasn't wearing contact lenses, and a time when he strategically placed you next to him in order to keep the focus on him directly. I wonder, is there any sort of recollection you have of your meetings with him where you got an insight into his character that feels very pertinent to the current moment or what we're seeing at the moment happening in negotiations over Ukraine?
Look, he does his homework. It's as simple as that. If you were ranking Putin, he's very well prepared. First of all, he's been at this for 25 years and he knows the context in and out. You're dealing with a sort of self-willed individual. He wasn't propelled forward by his father's money or his family making and paving the way for him, or entourages paving the way for him until he got to the Kremlin. He's somebody who is forged in the KGB, self-created, and somebody who's really done his homework, building the context in which he operates and on the person that he's interacting with. Now, again, he has a limited worldview, but you need to understand that worldview. And it's a pretty hard one. Trump and him have a similar worldview in terms of spheres of influence. Might makes right. There only being a few powerful countries and powerful individuals. And as a result of that, Putin doesn't really understand the dynamics in other countries. I don't think he understands Europe very well. He thinks he does because of his time at East Germany, but that's East German. And he's extraordinarily cynical in the same way that Trump is. But the other thing is that he's incredibly ruthless and cruel. Trump's ruthless, but he's not cruel in that. He is cruel in different ways, but he's not willing to preside over the mass slaughter of thousands and hundreds of thousands, maybe millions eventually of human beings. That's just not Trump, and that's Putin. He has a flagrant disregard for human life, apart from his own, I would imagine. But anyway.
Is there an anecdote, perhaps, from any engagements you had with Putin, something that you recall from seeing him directly?
Well, it's more the way that he talks about things. So in all of those settings of meetings, like the Valdai, group, when, he just talks about things in very callous, dismissive terms. And the other thing is also that he does believe in basically honing in on the top person, manipulating them and maneuvering them and saying the things that they want to hear and testing what he can really do to push their buttons. I've mentioned, a number of times before that he's always looking for a way to goad Trump into saying something that he can, use later. He thinks he has Trump mostly where he wants him, but at the other same time, I think there's a great deal of trepidation there still because Trump is unpredictable. And he can't give Putin what he wants, so he has to be managed. He can give him a lot of things that he wants, but he can't give him what he wants, which is a resounding victory over Ukraine and putting Russia in an unassailable position in Europe and globally, and him as well.
You obviously worked with Trump very closely on Russia policy during that first term. In terms of wielding his foreign policy, how has he changed since then?
The thing is, nobody works really that closely with Trump, apart from his absolute inner circle, the Steve Millers and other people who are like his courtiers. Everybody else is just trying to basically get some advice towards him.
Do you feel he's more insulated perhaps now than he was before, or do you think it's very much the same, that even though he had more prominent advisors around him who are at least experienced in those roles, he would still just dismiss their advice?
Yeah, the way that he's changed now is he just thinks and is pretty convinced he doesn't need any advice from all the other people. So there's all the people at the State Department. I'm sure they're advising Rubio, who looks like he's done his homework often, when he shows up for meetings and things, he's tried. And whenever Rubio shows up, many of my European other counterparts in the US and others said they have really good conversations with them at the kind of working level and around people like Keith Kellogg and others as well, because there's still some people there. But that's not what or who Trump is listening to. And I think that he's just convinced now he can do whatever he wants personally. Before, he was a little bit deferential here and there to various people, but now he's pretty convinced that he just doesn't have to pay attention to anything. And look, if you were him and you thought in the way that he did, it would be logical, because he's been an unbelievably resilient politician. He has come back to the presidency in a rather historic way. I think, so he had once before where someone was up and was then back in again, and everybody tells him that he's, the greatest gift to humanity and to the United States, the most unique person in American history. And all these things that the sycophants and courtiers and everybody else around him says. Even people who don't like him have to admit that he's an extraordinary character in US and world history. And when people keep telling you that, you think you're infallible. He has no doubt about himself right now. And perhaps what's changed is he's become deepened in his thinking about himself and his abilities.
Yeah. That sounds very hubristic, if I might add.
It is hubristic. And his powers of persuasion are really very, it's all about maximal application of force, but it's really financial. You notice he doesn't nuclear saber rattle Trump. So all these people who say, well, he could start a nuclear war, well, he wouldn't do it intentionally. He talks about them in a state of sort of shock and awe about the power of them. He believes that the US needs them for defense, but he's not going around there threatening, as Putin does, wild invasions. And interestingly, this is actually one thing that I don't mention that often, perhaps I should a bit more. There have been occasions where Trump has been a bit taken aback by some of the things that Putin has done, not just in terms of the bloodshed and just the mass slaughter of people, which seems so pointless to Trump because he doesn't quite, obviously, moon a state who would do that kind of thing. But it's also that when Putin first announced that the Russians had developed hypersonic missiles, which of course most people knew they had, but they did this big splashy reveal, basically, of the missiles. And it was during one of the national addresses that Putin was making to basically the Senate or the Russian Parliament or the Pals or something like that. I can't remember the exact assembly. It was one of the big Russian assemblies, annual address. And he has a huge screen behind him as he's speaking. And he talks about these missiles. And they look like they're coming in. He does a sort of simulation of a missile strike. And it looks striking like Florida. Picks this up. It could have been Kamchatka. It could have been some other peninsula, but didn't look like it. It looked a lot like Florida. And Trump afterwards actually said, and I was there, and witnessed it, why did he do that? Real countries don't have to do that. So even there, Trump thought this is the sort of thing basically the North Koreans do, which is go, look, I have big weapons and all I can do with them. If you're a real superpower and you're a real tough guy, in Trump's view, you don't have to do that, although he threatens all kinds of things all the time. But the whole thing with the nuclear missiles, he didn't get it.
Yeah. And what does that tell us about how he approaches Putin?
What it tells us, one thing, is that he realised for a moment that Putin might not be all that there might be something going on with Putin. But it also tells him an awful lot about the reason that he is deferential towards Putin is because he really is worried about the risk of a nuclear exchange.
The troubles in Northern Ireland are raging. Civilians find themselves caught in the crosshairs.
My father was covered in blood.
Behind the violence, there's a sinister secret.
He is probably the most high-profile British agent that we know of to date.
A covert unit of the British Army is connected to a string of murders.
If you could recruit a terrorist, that's the cream on the cake.
And the fight for justice continues.
There wasn't just one agent. Most of them were agents.
The latest podcast from The Telegraph. I'm Cara McGugan, and this is Bed of Lies. Search Bed of Lies wherever you're listening to this.
Hamish, do you want to leave us with your final thoughts?
Well, I will, Adélie, and it's more of an advert than a final thought. And I'm absolutely delighted that the Ukraine the Latest podcast is coming back to the Chalk History Festival down my way, just a few miles from where I'm talking to you at the moment, on the 27th of June, which I think will be outstanding. I know that there are many, many Ukraine the Latest listeners and people who rely on getting their first-hand information about Ukraine from that, who will be there. I will also be doing a piece with James Holland, the organiser, and General Mick Ryan, who I think is also a friend to the pod and is on occasionally. And we again be talking about Russian military tactics and perhaps the question of whether is the Russian military inept. Please do come along, and hopefully you might be there, Adélie, and the two amigos on the 27th as well. And of course, last year we had the great man DK. He'll be sadly missed, as he is everywhere, but really sadly missed at the Chalk History Festival next year. And you can find it on the web and all over the place. Chalk History Festival. Lovely to see people there if you can make it. And thanks very much for having me, Adélie.
Thanks, Hamish. And yes, indeed, the boys and I will be at the Chalk History Festival in June. We'll have more updates on that when we have more of the details of what we'll be doing. And we'll remember fondly David, as always. Thank you, Hamish, and have a good weekend. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.